All right, this is the video lecture. We're in the note packet called Years of Crisis or Between the Wars. And this particular topic is called Post-War Uncertainty. So this is after the Russian Revolution packet, and this is after World War I. We're picking up back in chronological order the events that happened literally between World War I and World War II. All right, first we're going to look at culture in the 1920s after World War II was over. All right, these are two individuals who deeply impacted the way people thought during the 1920s on a global basis. They both contributed in different fields, but they were both, major contributors to, you know, the philosophy of the 1920s. So we have Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein. So on your notes, write in just a line. I'm going to give you more information than you need, but just write in what impact they had in the 1920s. So let's look at Sigmund Freud first. This is a summary of some of his thoughts. Human behavior is largely irrational. The unconscious brain, or part of our brain, influences us in ways we didn't fully anticipate. But the part you need to write down is just this last line here. This caused people to move away from faith and reason, because if a unconscious part of your brain is affecting the way that you act, then maybe not everything is not as logical as they thought it was. So that contributed to the thinking of the 20s. Another person was Albert Einstein. All right, he's a scientist and he contributed these different scientific ideas, but the main point here is this last one, is what he contributed to the idea of light and space and time relative to light and where you are in the world, challenged Newton's ideas. And why that's important is because Newton's ideas had been the foundation of scientific theory for several hundred years. So this was really groundbreaking ideas that Einstein proposed. And it's like, if that's not true, what else isn't true? Is what people usually thought about. All right. All right, a lot of people, artists who came out of World War I, the topic of their writing reflected the experience of going through World War I. So these are some characteristics, impacts that World War I had on philosophers and writers. So they questioned ideas on progress and reason, like maybe society isn't going forward in a better way like we thought. Right? There's a lot of fear about the future. If World War I could happen, what else could happen? Very, very scary. And also, whenever something goes bad, the first thing humanity blames is God. That's why we call them acts of God. So after World War I, this horribly traumatic event, people began to doubt whether or not what they believed about religion was true or not. All right, there were a lot of artists in particular that decided to live together, so to speak, after, not literally together, but in the same city. And collectively, they were known as the Lost Generation. This is Ernest Hemingway over here. And so they lived in Paris. They ate outside in these cafes. They lived kind of tumultuous lives. And that was kind of the trendy thing to do. All right. All right. A lot of art in the 1920s focused on, maybe it had an influence from Freud, but they focused on this emotional, maybe tapping into the subconscious a little bit. And so in this world of emotion and imagination, which is a little less grounded than reality, like a realist would have done, some new art movements came out of this time. One of the most famous ones is this art movement called Cubism. Cubism had some interesting characteristics. On the top here, you've got the two most famous Cubist artists. The first one is by far the most famous, Pablo Picasso. But some unusual characteristics of Cubism, as it says there, right here. So transform natural shapes into geometric ones. So like a person's face, Renaissance artists would have painted it exactly like it is. A Cubist artist is going to paint it in geometric shapes. And some people's faces are more geometric than others. That came up with an interesting outcome. Objects broken down into different parts, sharp angles and edges, and so that was a little unusual. Not everything fits that pattern in reality. And several views depicted at the same time. If you can imagine, if you've ever gone into a photo booth and you've taken like 5 pictures in sequence, if somehow you were able to take those 5 pictures and smash them together to create one picture with every image on top of it, that's what I mean by Cubism. Really interesting style. So let me show you a famous one here. This is one of Picasso's. I won't tell you the name of it right now because that'll reveal what's going on. I always like to ask students, a little harder to do in this format, But if you think for yourself a second, what is this a picture of? What is happening in this scene? In the past, students have said things like, this woman's eating a piece of cake or pizza. Woman Eating, maybe, is the title of it. Some people aren't even sure that this is a woman, but it is. I guess I gave that away. But this is actually entitled Weeping Woman. You can see the tears coming out of her eyes, and this is actually a handkerchief. You know, sometimes people blow their nose when they cry too much because their nose gets runny. So this is actually a woman. And you see the multiple perspectives here. You have the view looking straight ahead, the profile on the bottom part of the face. Really interesting style of writing that came out of the 20s. This is kind of how people felt about the world. It's all crazy. All right, the art that mixed the world of dreams with real life was called surrealism. It's obviously very different than realism we've had in the previous chapter. So this dealt with the dream world. Again, maybe tapping into that idea that Freud introduced, that the subconscious is influencing us. What does that look like? If we paint a picture of the subconscious world or subconscious mind, what would it look like? A famous painting in this style is this one here. It's called Persistence of Memory, and the artist is Salvador Dali. This is a famous one about the melting clocks, and if you think about in our world, there's very few things you can rely on, but you can rely on time. You can always trust time. It never fails you. The rules never change. So this is an interesting painting about what if time wasn't something that was subjective. And so this idea of melting clocks is tapping into this subconscious sort of a style. Another thing that became famous in the 20s was jazz music. Right? This was became synonymous. I don't know that jazz itself embraces freedom necessarily, but this style of music became synonymous with a new way of living. You had women. You probably have heard this in the 1920s. They shortened their hair, they shortened their skirts, they went out and they partied and they drank and they smoked. And so there's a renewed sense of freedom that surrounds jazz music, but in itself is not necessarily more freeing. But that was a trend in the 20s. Another trend in the 20s was an automobile. People started to get automobiles. They were being mass produced, so they weren't as expensive individually. The Ford company could make 1,000 cars a day instead of 5 cars a day, so they don't have to charge as much. This transformed people's lives in a couple different ways. People traveled more. You could get in your car and you could go on a journey and visit someone in a different state or further away, and so it increased travel. People also started to live in different areas than they work. Us living near the 91, we can understand that this idea of commuting to a different place than where you work, that kind of started in the 1920s. And also all these new industries to help people who are traveling, like side-of-the-road diners and overnight motels and stuff like that, to serve this mobile population became new also. All right, other people. There's some people that were famous in the 1920s. This is Charles Lindbergh. He became famous because he was the first to fly from the United States to Paris or Europe nonstop, and he's the first person to ever do that. This was a 33-hour flight, so he had to stay awake for 33 hours to do this flight. There's a riveting movie with the guy from It's a Wonderful Life detailing his struggle to stay awake for 33 hours. The movie isn't 33 hours, but it's pretty exciting. It's a guy in a cockpit, and that's the extent of it. So he was famous. He was one of the first international celebrities because he was famous in America because he was an American, and he was famous in Europe because that's where he landed. And so when he landed, he was an instant international hero. So Charles Lindbergh. And that's his famous plane in the back, Spirit of St. Louis. All right, other people followed his pattern and tried to do new acts of flight. Now, it wasn't all men. Some women got involved as well. Amelia Earhart was flying around the Atlantic, and was the first to fly around the Atlantic, but then she also, on another flight, got lost, and nobody exactly knows what happened to Amelia Earhart. She disappeared while flying her plane. Most people assume she crashed in the ocean, and it was just too expansive to be able to find her. But I just saw an article a couple of years ago that someone felt like they had a picture of Amelia Earhart. Like maybe she didn't die and she just lived a life of obscurity for the rest of her life. So that's one of those mysteries of history. All right, another thing that was developed in the 1920s was radio. Marconi's radio was really, really important for communicating messages and also helped entertainment as well. Another form of entertainment in the 1920s was movies. You probably recognize this. Right? This is Griffith Park back there in the background there, right? The 1920s Los Angeles. And that is what the sign used to say, Hollywood Land, until they changed it. But a lot of the movies were made in Los Angeles, and so that's where this reputation of movies came from. And one of the most famous actors of the 1920s in this new movie industry was this guy. His name was Charlie Chaplin, and he was famous for his silent films, if you can imagine such a thing. You can enjoy a film where nobody talks, but he was just really this great comedic actor that didn't do it, conveyed all this humor without saying any words. So hopefully you enjoyed that little look at 1920s movie, where they enjoyed movies in the 1920s.